There is a very popular restaurant in Manhattan's East Village called Prune. The tables are jammed so closely together in this restaurant that if you put down your glass of wine, even for just 1 second, you may realize that you actually placed it on your neighbor's table. Prune was started back in 1999 by Chef Gabrielle Hamilton. She started as a caterer with a vision. She writes, "I could see vividly what it would become, the intimate dinner party I would throw every night in this charming, quirky space." She continues, "In the beginning, I was closed on Mondays, ran only 6 dinner shifts, and paid myself $425 a week. I got a very positive review in the New York Times, and thereafter we were packed. When I added a 7th dinner in 2000, I was able to hire a full-time sous chef. When I added weekend brunch, it wound up being popular enough to let me buy out all 6 of the original investors. Suddenly, there we were, 14 services, 7 days a week, 30 employees. It was a thrilling and exhausting first 10 years with great momentum." Hamilton had realized her vision. When we realize a vision, it might not look or feel the way that we had first imagined. The circumstances change, or we change, and then, of course, the vision itself changes. After 20 years, Hamilton took a good look at how her dream had manifested itself. She had won 4 James Beard Awards, an Emmy for a PBS program, and was the author of a best-selling book. She had arrived. Yet one night she found herself in her restaurant's kitchen, flat on her stomach, on the floor, covered in a painter's paper coverall suit, maneuvering a garden hose rigged up to a faucet. She'd poured bleach and Palmolive and degreaser behind the range, trying to blast out the deep, dark, unreachable corners of the sauté station, where lost eggshells, green scrubbies, hollow marrow bones, tasting spoons and cake testers, tongs and the occasional sizzle plate all get trapped and forgotten during service. In the restaurant's earlier years, she had hired professional cleaners to do this deep clean. But now, even at the height of her restaurant's popularity, she couldn't afford that luxury. So she found her hair matted, goggles speckled, and her whole body covered with egg yolk. She asked herself, it's always been hard, but when did it get this hard? And then, when the pandemic hit Manhattan in March, just 5 hours before the orders came to shut down all of New York City, Hamilton had announced to her staff the painful decision she'd made to close down her beloved restaurant. The restaurant, which was not only her realized vision, but also her livelihood, and the livelihood for her beloved employees. Hamilton can't know what the future looks like for her restaurant, or for any restaurant, so she wonders aloud. When we are sorting through the restaurant obituaries, will we know for sure that it was not because the weary veteran chef decided, as I have often been tempted myself in these weeks, to quietly walk out the open back door of a building that has been burning for quite some time? Today, we declare, Unetana tokef kedushat hayom, ki hu nora va'ayom, mi yichye umi yamut. Let us proclaim the sacred power of this day. It is awesome and full of dread. Who shall live and who shall die? This question, this metaphor really carries more weight this year than perhaps ever before in our lifetimes. It's not just restaurant owners who are asking this about restaurants. we are all more acutely aware that our very lives are fragile. The High Holy Days serve to remind us of our own mortality so that we might live with greater intentionality. This year, we almost don't even need the harsh reminder, as the pandemic constantly reminds us of our vulnerability. This morning, we heard the unsettling story about Abraham testing God or God testing Abraham. There is so much to unpack in the story of the binding of Isaac, and yet this year, I find myself wondering, why was Abraham chosen in the first place? Earlier in his life, God said to Abraham, "Lech lecha, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you." Why was Abraham chosen to journey towards the promised land? What qualified him to start a quiet revolution that would change the very course of human history? The ancient rabbis ask these questions too, and they offer a parable. Abraham is like a traveler who would trek from one destination to another. One day the traveler looked up and saw in the distance a birah doleket, a glowing palace. But when he looked closer, he realized that the palace was in flames. It was burning. He asked, could it be that this palace doesn't have an owner? Just then, the owner of the palace appeared, saying, "I am the owner of the palace." What a strange story. The ancient rabbis used this parable to explain Abraham's outlook on the world. Abraham saw that the entire world was a beautiful palace, and yet the palace was glowing. It was lit ablaze, and it was burning. Abraham appreciated the beauty and the order of the world, the sun rising each morning, the seasons coming in their time, the sounds of birds chirping and the sea flowing and the whistling of the wind through the trees, babies who are born and children who come of age, people who unite their lives together through friendship, fellowship, and marriage, the knowledge and even wisdom that comes with study and experience, the sun that lights the earth by day and the moon and the stars by night. And at the same time, Abraham also noticed the destructive danger that threatened to take away the beautiful order of the world. He saw the giant flames of injustice, the flames of immorality, the flames of godlessness, tyranny, cruelty, and brutality. He also noticed the smaller sparks, the sparks of indifference, the sparks of numbness that left people feeling powerless to act against the evil that surrounded them. Just like the traveler, Abraham noticed the beautiful world burning and asked aloud, could it really be that this world exists without a ruler? This time God answered, saying, I am the ruler, the sovereign of the universe. Abraham noticed the beauty of the palace, and he noticed that it was on fire. He held both truths at once. And so he asked, how could there be a world so filled with beauty if there wasn't an architect behind its brilliant design? And also he cried, if there is a holy architect, an all-powerful God, how could that God just let it all burn? The rabbis believe that God chose Abraham because he appreciated the paradox. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks teaches it is in that cry, that sacred discontent, that Abraham's journey begins. In that cry, Abraham has a vision of what the world could be. He spends the rest of his life as God's partner, working to extinguish the flames and to realize a vision for a better, more complete world. This has been a difficult year. We have suffered from extreme loneliness. We worry because we have lost our income. We are exhausted from giving so much of ourselves while we work from home and care for our children. Small, everyday decisions such as, can I go to work, to the store? Can I see my grandchildren? Can the children have a play date? Now weigh heavily on our minds, as nobody knows for certain how to keep each other and ourselves safe. Living in the midst of so much uncertainty takes a serious toll on all of us. And we are suffering. People in our families, in our communities, in our nation, and all over the world are sick and dying. And in the midst of this deep suffering, we suffer even more because we cannot reach out and hold each other's hands, or embrace each other with a hug, or come together in prayer on this, the birthday of the world. Our world has been on fire for some time now, and like the traveler, we cannot look away. We are now aware of the injustice, the immorality, the godlessness, the tyranny, cruelty, and brutality that exists in our world. And we are aware of the strong temptation to yield to feelings of indifference, of numbness, or to believing that we are powerless. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to lift up our heads and to see that the palace has been on fire for quite some time now. It's not the virus itself that discriminates, causing disproportionately more deaths among people of color. Rather, our society functions in a way that perpetuates systemic racism in healthcare, in the way we police ourselves, in education, in immigration, and really in almost every sector we can imagine. We now cannot look away from the people who do the most essential work, the medical professionals and the janitors, the teachers and the postal workers, the grocery clerks and public transit workers, and so many others who are not only undervalued, but deemed by our society to be disposable. We cannot look away from the knowledge that many children go hungry, and many children live in abusive homes. And we cannot look away from the disparity between the haves and the have-nots, between the ones who are seen and the ones who are made to feel invisible. And we cannot look away from the fires and the floods that come as a result of our Earth's changing climate. There is so much more from which we cannot look away. And that's just on a national scale. There are local fires too in our community, in our homes, and yes, even within ourselves. We've seen this before. Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham, saw this before. He didn't just notice the flames, he became God's partner in extinguishing them. Abraham responded to God's challenge. Before he noticed the Birah Doleket, the burning palace, nobody before him had ever considered the beauty and the destruction together at once. Nobody bothered to ask who was behind it all, the good and the bad. Could it be the same one? Abraham noticed, and once he noticed, he conceived of a new vision for his life, for his community, for the whole world. And then he set out to realize that vision. He changed the course of his life, and in turn, he changed the course of much of human history. Gabrielle Hamilton, the chef and owner of Prune, is in some ways like Abraham. She realized her beautiful restaurant was burning. It had been burning for years before the pandemic ever hit. And so she spent these months imagining a new vision for her restaurant. She says, "I want round tables, big tables, 6-people tables, 8 tops, early supper, home before midnight, long, lingering, civilized Sunday lunches with sun streaming in through the front French doors. I want old regulars to wander back into the kitchen while I lift the lids off the pots and show them what there is to eat. So I'm going to let the restaurant sleep, like the beauty she is, shallow breathing, dormant, bills unpaid, and see what she looks like when she wakes up so well-rested, young all over again." Hamilton realizes that actually, the restaurant as it existed before the pandemic was ultimately unsustainable. Coronavirus shed a light on that. And so now it's time for her to pause, to be still, to reevaluate, to engage in a process of re-envisioning for her restaurant and for her life, so that she can emerge from this time stronger and healthier. How can we see this time as one of reflection and renewal? What was broken before any of us had ever even heard of COVID-19? Deep down, what aspects of our lives weren't quite right, but we tolerated them anyway because we were caught up in the inertia and we couldn't imagine anything different? What things were burning under our noses, barely detected? Now that we have been forced to pause and to be still, what are we seeing differently than we did before? What changes do we need to make as we move forward? How can we ensure that when we emerge from the crisis, that we won't go back to the way things were before? Like Abraham, we see a beautiful palace burning, and we also ask, where is God in this mess? Rabbi Baruch tells a story of his grandson Yechiel, who was playing hide and seek with another child. Yechiel hid himself well and waited for his playmate to find him. After waiting a long time, Yechiel came out from his hiding place, but the other child was nowhere in sight. Now, Yechiel realized that his playmate had not even looked for him. Weeping, Yechiel came to his grandfather to complain of his faithless friend. Rabbi Baruch's eyes, too, brimmed with tears. And he said, "God says the same thing. I hide, but no one wants to seek me." In Abraham's time, too, and for generations before Abraham, God hid, waiting for people to begin seeking. Abraham did just that. He sought the divine. The truth is, Abraham didn't have all the answers, but he knew 2 things. First, that the world, even with all of its flaws, was in fact beautiful. And secondly, at the same time, Abraham knew that the whole world was burning. What made Abraham remarkable was that he held not only these paradoxical truths, but that he also sought the divine. Though he didn't know exactly what the promised land would look like, he set out on his journey to become God's partner nonetheless. We too must be like Abraham. None of us have all the answers either, and yet we have to start somewhere. We must appreciate the beauty and take note of the destructive forces. And we must search our own souls asking, where is God in the midst of it all? The book of Proverbs teaches, Ner Adonai nishmat Adam. The human spirit is God's light. God's light exists within our own souls, our own spirits. We must seek God within ourselves, because that's where we'll find God's spiritual light. That very light is what will guide us out of even the deepest darkness. We now have an opportunity, a sacred obligation, to engage in a process of re-envisioning our own lives. Globally, this terrible virus had shed light on so many injustices, and yet this crisis can serve as a reminder that God is our inner light. Let's kindle those inner lights so that they burn brightly. And let's use those lights to guide us as we extinguish the destructive flames of the burning palace. And then we can emerge from this wreckage to work towards realizing our own renewed vision for our world, our community, and for ourselves.